I saw the man who orchestrated the deaths of millions. When I first looked into his eyes, I expected to see a monster. But all I saw was an ordinary man. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. I was there, in that coldly lit room, surrounded by journalists, survivors, and armed soldiers. And right in the center, isolated in a bulletproof glass box, was he, Adolf Eichmann, the man behind the logistics of the Holocaust, the architect of the trains that carried millions to their deaths. I stared at him. I tried to find some trace of remorse, some sign of guilt, but there was nothing, not a shadow of regret, just a blank, bureaucratic, almost tedious expression. In that instant, everything I believed about evil began to crumble. I had always imagined evil had a cruel, deformed, crazed face. But what I saw there was banality, coldness, indifference, and that discovery destroyed me inside. I'll tell you everything, what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. But I'm warning you, this story will move you. It will make you rethink what it means to be human, and how far we can go when we blindly obey. If you, like me, believe that some stories need to be remembered so they never happen again, then subscribe to this channel. Because what you'll see isn't just history, it's a warning. This is not just a trial. It's a journey into the heart of darkness. I will never forget the feeling that morning. The sky over Jerusalem was clear, but the air felt heavy. Every step I took toward the courthouse plunged me into a silence that not even the birds dared break. And I knew why. The entire city was suspended in time, as if everyone was holding their breath. Because, on that day, a cursed name would stand before justice. Adolf Eichmann, a man who, for decades, inhabited the nightmares of survivors, slipped through the cracks of history, and finally resurfaced inside a glass cell. Alive! But what was about to happen there was no ordinary trial. It was something much bigger, and more dangerous. Eichmann was no ordinary murderer. He didn't pull triggers, he didn't raise whips, he didn't light ovens. He simply organized. He planned. He calculated train schedules, the capacity of the cars, the logistics of the camps. He made the system work with German precision. He was a numbers cruncher, an engineer of death. And that was the part that haunted me most. How had someone so mediocre, so ordinary, become responsible for the deportation and death of millions? I had heard the reports. I had read the documents. But seeing that man in person, less than 20 meters away from me, made me feel something I can't explain with words. A mixture of disgust, fear, and bewilderment. Because Eichmann wasn't monstrous at all. He looked like any other civil servant. A pale, bald man with thick glasses. He sat erect, impassive, almost invisible, if not for the bulletproof glass box that isolated him from the world. And perhaps that was the most terrifying part, the realization that evil sometimes has no horns, no flaming eyes. He could be behind a desk, stamping papers with a clear conscience. As I waited for the session to begin, I wondered why I had come. I wasn't Jewish. I hadn't lost anyone in the camps. But there was something about that story that called to me, something that told me it mattered, that this tribunal was more than a chance to punish a criminal. It was a ritual, a historical exorcism, a way to look the past in the eye and say, "We remember." And at the same time, I was also afraid of what this trial would reveal about Eichmann, but, above all, afraid of what it would reveal about ourselves, because deep down I knew this trial wasn't just about him. It was about how far human beings are capable of going when they erase their own empathy, when they trade conscience for orders, when they decide to obey instead of thinking. You may think you already know how this story ends, but I assure you, the most disturbing part isn't the end. It's the journey there. So take a deep breath and come with me, because after hearing what I saw, what I felt, you will never look at history, or yourself, the same way again. My first encounter with the name Adolf Eichmann. I must have been 12 or 13. It was a typical night, the kind where the television was off, and all you could hear was the sound of the wind against the window and my grandfather's heavy breathing. He was sitting at the kitchen table, his eyes lost in a cup of tea that had already gone cold. He was a silent man, but that day he decided to speak. "Have you ever heard that name?" he asked, as if testing the weight of a memory before offering it to someone else. "Eichmann. Adolf Eichmann." I shook my head. No, I had never heard it. He looked at me as if this were both a blessing and a tragedy. My grandfather was a survivor, but he rarely spoke of what he saw. He never told me details of Auschwitz or the trains. He never told me how he lost his brothers, or why he woke up screaming in the early hours of the morning. But that night, it all began with that name, Eichmann. It was as if, by saying it, he opened a door he'd tried to keep locked for decades. And what came out wasn't just pain. It was something deeper. It was fear transformed into memory. He said that Eichmann wasn't a field soldier. He wasn't one of those who beat, who shouted, who killed with his own hands. Eichmann was worse. He was the man who organized the death machine. Cold, meticulous, efficient. Every train, every camp, every number, Eichmann knew. Eichmann decided. My grandfather remembered hearing his name whispered, like a cursed whisper among the prisoners. It wasn't a legend. It was a ghost that hovered over the tracks. When a new train arrived, packed with living bodies destined for disappearance, some would murmur, "Eichmann ordered it." At that moment, hearing my grandfather for the first time, something in me changed. I didn't know that man, but his name stuck with me, like a nagging echo in the back of my mind. Eichmann. The years passed. I grew up. I studied history. I watched documentaries. I read books. I saw photos. I saw piled-up corpses, mass graves, official letters with his signature. But what haunted me most wasn't the enormity of the crime. It was the coldness of the bureaucracy. Eichmann didn't kill. He planned his death. And he did it like someone organizing a spreadsheet, like someone calculating the arrival time of a train so that the cargo, and yes, that's how they referred to people, could be unloaded and sent to the ovens efficiently. He turned the Holocaust into a logistical operation, and that disturbed me deeply. With each new piece of information I discovered, the more I felt I needed to see this man, hear his voice, understand how someone like that builds himself, or unravels. So when I learned he had been captured, and that he would be tried, something pulled me closer. It was like a calling. I knew I needed to be there. I needed to bear witness. Because Eichmann wasn't just a criminal. He was the cruelest reflection of a truth no one wants to face. Sometimes evil comes dressed as normality, and I needed to see it with my own eyes, even if it would haunt me for the rest of my life. The news that shocked the world in 1960. It was an ordinary morning. I was walking down the street, distracted by the comings and goings of people, the smell of coffee wafting from the bakeries, the noise of a city that still seemed to be healing the wounds of war. Then I heard it. A man selling newspapers shouted on the corner, "Eichmann!" Captured. Alive. In that instant, my heart stopped. It was as if the world around me had frozen. That name, Eichmann. That name my grandfather whispered as if conjuring a nightmare. That name that symbolized invisible gears, trains full of innocence, cold orders signed with ink and contempt. And now he was alive. Arrested. In the hands of justice. I ran to the newsstand and grabbed the newspaper with trembling hands. The headline was printed in giant letters. Adolf Eichmann captured by Israeli Secret Service in Buenos Aires. I read it all right there, in the middle of the sidewalk, surrounded by strangers. The newspaper said he had lived for years under a false identity, as Ricardo Clement. He had a simple job, a family, a discreet routine in Argentina. A murderer hidden beneath the skin of an ordinary man. That part destroyed me, because, until that moment, part of me still believed that monsters carried visible signs, that evil left traces on faces. But no, Eichmann lived among the people. He took the bus. He bought bread. He said good morning to his neighbors. One of the men most responsible for the extermination of millions, living a peaceful domestic life, as if nothing had happened, as if nothing weighed on his conscience. And then, the newspaper reported in detail what sounded like a spy movie. Mossad agents watched him for months. They analyzed his movements. They discovered where he lived. And they waited for the right moment. On May 11, 1960, Eichmann got off the bus as he did every day. But that night, he didn't return home. He was approached by two agents. They threw him into a car. They taped his mouth shut. And they vanished with him into the darkness. In the following days, the Argentine government denounced the action as an illegal kidnapping. But Israel didn't back down. They confirmed it. Adolf Eichmann was in Jerusalem. He would be tried. The news spread around the world like a spark in a dry field. Survivors wept. Entire families, who had never had a face to blame for the loss of their loved ones, now did. It was him. It was Eichmann. I remember returning home that day in absolute silence. My grandfather was sitting in the armchair, his eyes on the floor, as if he sensed something had changed in the air. I placed the newspaper in front of him without saying a word. He didn't read it immediately. He simply ran his hand over the name printed in black letters. He touched the paper as if touching an old scar, and then he murmured, "So, he didn't escape." That gave me chills. Because, deep down, that was what we all feared, that he had escaped forever. But now, the impossible had happened. Eichmann would be tried. For the first time, one of the great architects of the final solution would be before cameras, judges, and living witnesses. And I knew I needed to be there, not just as an observer, but as someone who carried the weight of silenced voices. Someone who needed to see justice happen, or, at least, try to believe that it was still possible. This news wasn't just historical. It was a wake-up call, one of those rare moments when the past ceases to be memory and becomes present before our eyes. The hunt, what almost no one saw. For a long time, Eichmann was just a shadow. A living speck that escaped history books, wanted lists, and the Nuremberg trials. While others were tried, hanged, or died fleeing, he evaporated. Like smoke. For years, it was believed he was dead. Others said he lived under the protection of former Nazis, perhaps in the Middle East, perhaps in South America. But no one knew for sure. No one, except a few silent men who hadn't forgotten. What almost no one saw, and I only understood much later, was that the hunt for Eichmann had been going on long before the 1960 headlines. It was carried out in the dark, without fanfare, driven not by revenge, but by something colder, more implacable, memory. It was the Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service, that tracked him down. But the spark was lit by a young German woman, the daughter of a Nazi immigrant in Argentina. She suspected the true identity of Mr. Clement, the quiet man who lived with an austere woman in a simple house in Buenos Aires. She overheard conversations. She saw suspicious letters. And, unknowingly, she betrayed one of the most dangerous men in modern history. When the Israeli agents received the information, they weren't sure they could believe it. But they decided to investigate. They spent weeks analyzing, photographing, and then a photo, a face. Years older, yes, but it was him, Adolf Eichmann. There was no fuss. No local police were notified. Argentina, at the time, was full of Nazi sympathizers. It wouldn't be safe to trust. The hunt needed to be clean and quiet. They rented a house near Eichmann's. They set up surveillance in shifts. They mapped his schedule, his habits, and they discovered he was predictable, religiously predictable. Every day, Eichmann left work, got off the bus at 7:40 p.m. and walked down the same street, unhurriedly, without fear, as if the world had forgotten him. But the world hadn't forgotten. And finally, the day arrived. May 11th, 1960. A night like any other for him. Eichmann got off the bus. He walked distractedly, as always. 2 agents were waiting for him. One of them called him by his assumed name, Ricardo. Eichmann turned. It was the last gesture of freedom of his life. They grabbed him. One of them covered his mouth. The other threw him into the car. There was no struggle. There was no scream. Eichmann knew. He knew that, after so many years, the past had taken its toll. For the next few days, he hid in a secure location while agents planned how to get him out of Argentina. It was a risky, nearly impossible operation. But they succeeded. In complete silence, he was loaded onto an El Al plane, sedated and disguised as a sick flight attendant. And as they crossed Israeli airspace, it became official. Adolf Eichmann was in Jerusalem, ready to stand trial. This story, it wasn't a fabrication. It wasn't a legend. It was real, frighteningly real. And what haunts me most to this day is not just the efficiency with which they found him, but the fact that, for so many years, he lived as if nothing had happened, without guilt, without remorse, as if the tracks, the fields, the train cars packed with the living dead, were just numbers in a report. That was what ate away at me. How can someone erase their soul so perfectly? And as I delved deeper into this story, a thought began to haunt me. What if he had never been caught? How many others still live like this? How many forgotten names still breathe among us, camouflaged by time? The trial hadn't even begun, and the weight of the silence was already unbearable. The kidnapping and the secret trip to Israel. When I first read the details of Adolf Eichmann's capture, it seemed like fiction. It seemed like a script written by someone who blended espionage, pain, and justice into a single, impossible narrative. But it wasn't fiction. It was real. And the deeper I delved, the more I realized how close to madness and genius this mission had come. That night, May 11th, 1960, was the end of the freedom of a man who was fleeing not only from justice, but from his own conscience. He left work as he did every day. He took the bus. He got off at his usual stop. The route home was always the same. Same steps, same gestures, same routine. But this time, someone was waiting for him in the dark. 2 Israeli agents were hiding in a parked car. The plan was quick, succeeding, quiet. They knew they wouldn't get a second chance. Eichmann got off the bus. He walked slowly. They approached. Ricardo Clement? He turned. Time froze. Within seconds, he was grabbed, thrown to the ground, and put into the car. All was silent. No screams. No witnesses. No trace. Argentina wouldn't know until it was too late. Eichmann was taken to a safe house. There, they kept him under surveillance. He barely spoke. He didn't resist. He didn't beg. His eyes were dry, but his face carried something that gives me chills to this day. An absurd calm. Days passed. Israel needed to get him out of there without arousing suspicion. International diplomacy was a ticking time bomb. Argentina would never accept a formal extradition. Eichmann wouldn't be handed over. Therefore, he would have to be taken away like a ghost. And the plan was bold. The country was about to celebrate 10 years of Israel's independence. An Israeli diplomatic delegation was to be present in Buenos Aires. Inside it, an El Al plane was to be made available. This would be Eichmann's transport. On the appointed day, he was dressed in a flight attendant's uniform, sedated, tied up, disguised as a sick crew member, carried like a patient in crisis, with permission to board in silence. The plan was so absurd that it worked. As the plane crossed Israeli airspace, one of the agents sitting next to him clenched his fists, looked out the window, and whispered, "Now he's ours." Eichmann woke up in Jerusalem, and the world awoke in shock. Argentina was furious. It accused Israel of violating its sovereignty. The whole world was debating what was legal, what was moral, what was legitimate. But no one could deny the essential. One of the main perpetrators of the Nazi extermination machine was finally where he should have been, facing justice. When I learned he was on Israeli soil, something in me changed. It was as if a cycle had begun to close, as if history had finally mustered the courage to face one of its darkest chapters. But even there, even surrounded, Eichmann maintained the same posture, the same coldness, the same neutral expression of someone carrying tons of death and sleeping peacefully. And in that moment, I began to wonder, would justice be able to break through that armor? Was someone like him truly capable of feeling guilt? Or were we facing something even more frightening, an empty man? The trial hadn't yet begun, but I already felt the weight, not just of history, but of everything that was yet to come. The courtroom, my first impression. I don't know exactly what I expected to find when I entered that courtroom in Jerusalem. Perhaps silence, perhaps reverence. But what I found was tension, a thick, dense, almost material tension. It hung in the air like ancient dust, and clung to one's skin. The place wasn't majestic. There were no ornaments, no stained glass windows, no solemn columns. It was cold, clean, and, paradoxically, oppressive. The room was full, but no one spoke loudly. There were journalists from every corner of the world, representatives of countries that never imagined seeing a Nazi on trial, alive, so many years after the end of the war. Survivors were in the front rows. Some were there simply to watch, others to speak, to relive, to remember what they had tried to forget. And at the center of it all, him, Adolf Eichmann, sitting inside a bulletproof glass box, like a dangerous relic, like a caged animal. But it wasn't what I expected. I imagined I'd find a monster, a face distorted by hatred, a presence filled with fury, like those that appeared in photos of the camps. But he didn't look like that. He looked like an ordinary man. He wore a dark suit. His hair was combed. He wore thick glasses and read documents with an air of bureaucratic concentration. He was calm, methodical. There was something unsettling about his normality. I remember thinking, is that all? Is this the man behind so many horrors? And that's when something hit me hard. The true face of evil can be the absence of any face at all. No visible hatred. No pleasure in pain. Just function. Eichmann looked more like an accountant than a murderer. More like a clerk stamping orders than someone deciding fates. He didn't look at the public. He didn't look at anyone. His eyes wandered over the papers. And I wondered, did he know where he was? Did he understand the weight of the room he found himself in? Or was it that, in his mind, he was still just following orders? There was a strange irony in that scene. The whole world was gathered to judge a man who, until that moment, didn't seem to believe he had done anything wrong. The prosecution began listing the crimes, the deportations, the trains, the numbers, the deaths. Eichmann listened. He took notes. He murmured instructions to his lawyer, as if he were handling an accounting audit, as if the extermination were a logistical problem, as if the pain of millions were a calculation. It was at that moment that I understood. The trial wasn't just about punishment. It was about revealing, showing the world and ourselves that evil doesn't always come with fury. Sometimes they come with file folders, with signed orders, with silence. I felt anger. But more than that, I felt fear. Because the Eichmann I saw there could have been anyone. He didn't look like a psychopath. He looked normal. And that was the most terrifying thing. The testimonies, voices from hell. I thought you'd heard enough, that I already knew enough. But I wasn't prepared for what came next. When the first testimonies began, the courtroom changed. The atmosphere, previously tense, became almost unbearable. It was as if the past invaded the room with all its pent-up fury, as if the ghosts Eichmann helped create had finally found their voice. The first witness was an elderly, thin man, his skin scarred by years gone by. He ascended the podium slowly, with hesitant steps. But when he began to speak, there was no more hesitation. He spoke of crowded train cars, of muffled screams, of children being separated from their parents in the cold, of shoes left behind, piled high like souvenirs no one wanted to carry. Each word was a knife. It cut the air. It cut the soul. I looked at Eichmann. Nothing. No reaction. He listened, as if listening to some ordinary report. Sometimes he turned to the lawyer and whispered something. Sometimes I wrote it down. But never looked at the speaker. A woman was called. An Auschwitz survivor. He spoke of the selection on the ramp, of the exact moment she was separated from her sister, of the smell of burning flesh and hair that never left her nose. She trembled as she told it, but she didn't cry. Crying was a luxury she no longer had. Eichmann remained motionless. His right hand rested on his chin. His left hand held a pen. Then came a man who had seen his family being pushed onto a train, on Eichmann's direct orders. He screamed. He yelled in the courtroom. He pointed his finger at the glass box. You sent them. You killed them with a stamp. The entire room fell silent. A heavy, profound silence that seemed to last minutes. Eichmann didn't respond. He just lowered his eyes and went back to writing. It was at that point that I understood something brutal. That trial wasn't just legal. It was ritual. It was purgation. It was testimony. Every survivor who went up there didn't just want justice. They wanted to be heard. They wanted to be seen. Because for years, decades, they had been ignored, silenced. And now, there they were, before the man who tried to erase them from history. One by one, they rose from the ashes, not as victims, but as living proof that memory is stronger than forgetting. Eichmann remained inert. No tears, no apologies, just silence. And I thought, does he feel anything? Or is this emptiness inside him all that's left? There was a moment when I couldn't look anymore. I closed my eyes. But still, I heard the voices, the words, the names, so many names, each one a life, an absence that spoke louder than 1,000 presences. I left that session heavier than I entered, not out of anger, but out of something worse, helplessness, because, faced with the horror revealed in each account, everything seemed small, even justice itself. But one thing was certain. No one in that room would leave the same. And, if you've listened this far, perhaps now you understand why this trial wasn't just historic. He was human, terribly human. Eichmann's coldness, the banality of evil. The more days piled up in court, the more the weight of those testimonies grew within me. Each story was an open wound, each testimony a scar exposed to the world. And yet, Eichmann remained intact, sitting in his glass box, unfazed. He didn't sweat. He didn't stutter. He didn't apologize. He didn't cry. At first, I thought he was faking it, that it was a calculated defense, an emotional shield to survive that bombardment of pain. But after so much time observing every gesture, every micro-expression, I began to understand. That wasn't pretense. It was conviction. Eichmann truly believed he had done nothing wrong. He repeated, like a mantra, like a broken robot, I was only following orders. And there, in that simple, dry sentence, I saw the abyss. Because it wasn't sadism. It wasn't a pleasure in cruelty. It was indifference. Eichmann didn't hate Jews, at least, not in the way we'd imagine a fanatic would. He just performed his duties. He signed deportation orders. He coordinated train schedules. He oversaw efficiency, statistics. He treated death as logistics, lives as numbers, entire families as operational problems. And that's where it all gets scarier. Because, unlike many war criminals, Eichmann wasn't a figure warped by hatred. He was the opposite. He was the model employee, the zealous executor of a system. And it was at this point that I remembered what Hannah Arendt wrote, as she followed this very trial. The banality of evil, an expression that, at first glance, seems weak. But after seeing Eichmann there, it gained an unbearable power. Evil wasn't monstrous. It was bureaucratic. It didn't need to scream or foam with rage. Evil could wear a suit and tie. It could be punctual, polite, organized. And this realization gave me chills. because if evil can be so common, then any of us can become Eichmann. All it takes is a structure. All it takes is an order. All it takes is for conscience to be switched off, and the function to be obeyed. During one of the interrogations, a prosecutor asked Eichmann if he felt regret. He replied coldly, "I regret that fate placed me in a position where I had to act according to orders." He didn't regret the dead. He regretted having been the instrument, as if he were a victim, as if I were innocent. I remember clenching my fists. I wanted to scream. But scream for what? Eichmann didn't listen. He recorded. And deep down, perhaps that was his greatest crime. It wasn't sadism. It was the absence of humanity, the ability to organize death into tables, to describe extermination as a necessary procedure, to push buttons and sleep peacefully. That day, I left the courtroom without looking back. Eichmann's silence screamed inside me, and I thought, perhaps the greatest horrors in the world aren't committed by monsters, but by ordinary men, who simply stop feeling. And at that moment, a question began to torment me. Would I, under certain circumstances, also obey? Would anyone obey? The answer haunts me to this day. The defense strategy. I was just following orders. I already knew, even before the trial began, what his strategy would be, and it was no surprise when I heard Eichmann repeat, almost mechanically, that phrase that seemed to be his only argument. I was just following orders. It was as if he had rehearsed it for years, as if he had prepared to turn responsibility into acquittal, in a defense so simple, so direct, that it was frightening in its coldness. He didn't deny having participated in the Holocaust. He didn't claim to be innocent. He accepted that he did what he did. But, for him, it was simply fulfilling a function, an obligation. This justification, which may seem foolish, carried immense danger, because it's not just an excuse for criminals. It's also a warning. Hearing him say this, I felt the room shrink. It was as if the weight of what he denied feeling, guilt, remorse, humanity, turned into a giant shadow that threatened to swallow everything around him. But then, something inside me rebelled. I thought of all the people who heard his testimony, of every survivor who told how they saw their families ripped away, their dreams destroyed, and I asked myself, how could a man so cold, so calculating think this was just following orders? He said he couldn't refuse, that he was a prisoner of the system, a pawn in a machine that couldn't be stopped, that if not him, someone else would take his place. But those words rang hollow, because even within a cruel system, there is a choice. There are times when one can say, no. But Eichmann chose to say, yes. The defense didn't try to hide the fact that he organized deportations. They didn't try to downplay his involvement. He simply shifted the blame up an invisible chain of command. And this shifting hit me like a punch in the gut, because, somehow, I felt he wanted us to believe that responsibility could be shifted outside of himself, that evil could be distributed, shared, fragmented, that no one was truly guilty. But for me, for those who heard the victims' stories, this was unacceptable. One of the most powerful moments was when the prosecutor asked directly, if you had the power to stop everything, would you have stopped it? Eichmann replied, in the same cold voice, I had no power. I had a duty. And in that instant, I saw that there wasn't just one man. There was an idea, a perverse ideology that turns duty into crime, that turns blind obedience into genocide, That was when I understood that the trial wasn't just for him. It was for all of us. For everyone who has ever felt pressured to close their eyes. For everyone who has ever convinced themselves that obedience was better than questioning. The phrase, "I was only obeying orders," has become a symbol of what can happen when responsibility is abandoned, when silence becomes complicity. And as Eichmann repeated this defense, I felt the weight of all the silenced voices that court was trying to return to the world. Because, in the end, what was on trial was not just one man. It was humanity's capacity to resist evil, to say no, to be more than cogs in a machine. And I know that, if you're listening to this lesson needs to stay with you, because the greatest crime is not obeying orders. It's forgetting that we have the choice not to obey. The fury of the survivors, confronting the monster. I will never forget the day I saw the survivors face Eichmann in court. It was a moment charged with an almost palpable energy, a tension that permeated the room and struck everyone present with brutal force. They were no longer silent victims. They were not numbers in history books. They were real people, with stories, with memories they carried like deep, living, pulsing scars. When the door of the glass box opened for one of these witnesses to take the stand, I felt the air vibrate. It was as if the wall separating the past from the present had cracked, and that crack let out all the pain he had caused. I saw an elderly woman, barely able to stand, but whose gaze burned like fire. She looked directly at Eichmann and, for a moment, said nothing. Only silence, thick and heavy, filled the room. And then, in a firm voice, she began to tell what he had done to her family. How he had separated her mother, her father, her brothers, sending them to their deaths. I saw tears that were not of sadness, but of an old, raw rage. She didn't ask for mercy. She demanded justice. Some other survivors began to cry. But these were not tears of despair. They were tears of strength, of those who, despite their suffering, were there to face the monster that had once almost destroyed them. Eichmann, in that moment, was no longer the bureaucratic official, the cold-spoken common man. He was the embodiment of the evil they had faced, and which could now no longer hide. I remember a witness who, her voice trembling, shouted at him, "You stole everything from me. My childhood, my family, my life." And silence, once again, fell over the room. But there was something different about that silence. It was the silence of the truth that could not be denied. As I watched all of this, I realized that the trial was not just a legal proceeding. It was a battle between memory and oblivion, between justice and impunity. It was the moment when the past cried out to be heard. And I felt, in that instant, that the power of those survivors was immense, because, despite the pain, they had resisted. They had survived. And now they stood there, before the man who tried to erase their lives, to show that the truth would not be buried. I couldn't help but wonder, if that fury were added to all the voices silenced by history, what power would it have? It was a power no court could ignore, a power that reminds us that justice is not just about laws, but about humanity. And I knew that day that the Eichmann trial would be remembered not only for the punishment of the man, but for the courage of those who faced the impossible. Because, in the end, it is this courage that keeps alive the hope that evil can be overcome. The verdict, the sentence that shocked the world. I will never forget the day the verdict was announced. That moment that seemed distant, but arrived with overwhelming force, like a wave of justice finally crashing against the shores of impunity. The courtroom was packed. Survivors, journalists, and officials all stared at the judge. In the silence preceding the sentencing, I felt the weight of all those stories, all those torn lives. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating. When the judge began to speak, his voice echoed cold and firm, each word cutting through the silence like a sharp blade. He described the crimes committed, one by one. He spoke of the deportations, the mass murders, Eichmann's decisive role in the machinery of Nazi horror. And then came the sentence. Guilty of crimes against the Jewish people, against humanity, against peace. The death sentence. I felt a mixture of relief and profound pain. Relief that justice had been served, even if belatedly. Pain that no sentence could restore the lives lost, the suffering caused. But what struck me most was Eichmann's gaze at that moment. There was no surprise. There was no regret. Only a silent, cold acceptance, almost as if he had already expected this fate. As the sentence was read, I thought of all those voices that echoed in the courtroom during the trial. Each witness who courageously stood up to tell their story. Every tear, every scream, every heavy silence. Everything converged on that moment of justice. But I also thought about the complexity of human justice. How can we judge a man who, despite his coldness, was a product of a sick system? How can we weigh individual responsibility in the face of the monstrous machinery of Nazism? I remembered Hannah Arendt's words about the banality of evil, and I felt that that trial wasn't just about one man, but about all of humanity facing its own shadows. When Eichmann was led away to serve his sentence, I felt it was a victory, but a bitter one, because the true fight against evil is far from over. It lies in the choices we make every day, in the courage to resist blind obedience, in the commitment to memory and justice. I left the courtroom with a feeling that, despite the pain and tragedy, justice could indeed prevail, but that it depended on us, on each and every one of us, to keep the flame of truth alive. And I want you to remember this too, that justice is not just a word. It is an act of courage. And that courage begins here, now, with you. If you want to continue exploring stories that defy time and reveal the darkest corners of the human soul, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because memory is our most powerful weapon against forgetting. The global impact of the trial, a new era for international justice. When the Eichmann trial came to an end, I felt something much greater than just the closure of a judicial process. It was as if a door had been opened to a new world, a world where justice could transcend borders, where crimes against humanity would no longer be forgotten or ignored. At that time, the concept of international justice was still fragile, almost experimental. But what we saw with Eichmann was something that forever changed the way the world views accountability for mass atrocities. I closely followed the reactions in several countries. Some celebrated the trial as a moral triumph, a victory of humanity over absolute evil. Others, however, criticized the way Israel had captured Eichmann. They claimed it was a violation of Argentine sovereignty. But for me, what really mattered was that, for the first time, a tribunal was trying not just a war criminal, but a symbol of the system that enabled the Holocaust. Eichmann was not just convicted as an individual. He was convicted as a representative of a model of government that institutionalized genocide. This trial paved the way for the world to begin to view crimes against humanity with the seriousness they deserve. What touched me most was the global recognition that following orders is no excuse for atrocities. Personal responsibility, even in totalitarian systems, was being reaffirmed. It was a powerful reminder. No matter how loud the order, or how deep the state pressure, the individual is still responsible for their actions. And more than that, Eichmann's trial inspired the creation of international tribunals, such as the International Criminal Court, which today strive to ensure that those who commit crimes against humanity are brought to justice, regardless of their location. As I reflected on this, I couldn't help but think of the weight this shift represented for humanity. Finally, there was a genuine attempt to make justice transcend political and cultural boundaries. But it wasn't an easy victory. The world still struggles against denialism, against indifference, against the repetition of the same mistakes. The Eichmann trial reminds us that justice is not an endpoint, but a constant journey. I felt, at that moment, deeply connected to this struggle, because every word spoken in court, every testimony, every argument, was a brick in the construction of a future where horror would no longer be possible. And this is a struggle that continues. Every time we remember what happened, every time we choose not to forget, we keep the flame of justice alive. If you feel this story needs to be heard and remembered, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Here, we explore not only humanity's dark past, but also the lessons it leaves us, so that the future can be different. Follow this journey with me, because memory is our best weapon against silence and impunity. The legacy of the trial: memory, justice, and eternal vigilance. When the court concluded Adolf Eichmann's trial, it wasn't just a man who was condemned. It was the beginning of a new era, an era where the memory of horror became an eternal commitment, and, at the same time, a warning for the future. I clearly remember feeling that conviction carried a weight far greater than a simple death sentence. It was a symbol that the world could no longer turn a blind eye to the atrocities committed in the name of power, ideology, or blind obedience. But what struck me most over time was realizing that Eichmann's trial wasn't just about the past. It spoke to the present. It called us to constant vigilance. Because justice doesn't end when the judge strikes the gavel. It begins there. It begins with our ability to remember, to teach, to denounce, to keep the flame of conscience burning. I realized that the greatest legacy of that trial was not the punishment of a criminal, but the reaffirmation of our collective responsibility, that we are all guardians of memory, and, therefore, guardians of justice. And this is an arduous task, because time is a cruel enemy of remembrance. Forgetting can creep in silently, erasing facts, minimizing pain, turning victims into statistics. That's why it's so important to talk about it, to tell these stories, to bring the past into the present, not to relive suffering, but to learn from it. Throughout my research, I understood that the Eichmann trial opened a space for the world to look at history with a critical eye, so that order would never again be accepted as an excuse for crime, so that humanity would realize that evil may be banal, but its consequences are devastating. I also learned that this eternal vigilance requires courage. Courage to question, to resist, to take a stand against injustices, even when they seem small or distant. Because evil, when ignored, grows. Today, when I think of that courtroom, I feel it represents a promise that the horror will never be forgotten, and that justice, however delayed, can prevail. But for that promise to remain alive, we must keep fighting. We must keep remembering. And we must remain vigilant, because history has shown that evil can return if we are not vigilant. And that's why I do this work, so that these voices never fall silent, so that the Eichmann trial may be more than a page in a book. Be a warning, a call. If you feel this responsibility along with me, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Let's work together to keep the memory alive, strengthen justice, and ensure that the future never forgets the past. Because, in the end, the greatest legacy of the trial is this: the eternal vigilance of human conscience. Final reflections and a call to action. The trial that still affects us today. As I close this chapter of history, I can't help but feel a weight that still lingers. The trial of Adolf Eichmann wasn't just a distant event or an isolated legal proceeding. It is a profound mark on our collective consciousness, a disturbing mirror that forces us to face who we are, where we can go, and what we can never allow to happen again. As I told this story, I thought a lot about what justice means, what it means to remember, and what it means to resist. Because Eichmann's trial was more than just condemning a man. It was the moment humanity decided that blind obedience can never be an excuse for evil. But I also ask myself, and I ask you now, what would you do if you were in his shoes? If you were faced with a choice between questioning orders or simply obeying? Would you, under any circumstances, have the courage to say no? These are not easy questions, nor should they be. They cut deep because they force us to look within, to recognize that evil is sometimes closer than we imagine, within ourselves, in our decisions, in our silences. I believe that the greatest legacy of this trial is precisely this uneasiness, this flame that ignites in those who hear this story and realize that justice isn't something that happens only in the courtroom, but in everyday life, in the choices we make every day. Every time someone decides not to remain silent in the face of injustice, every time someone chooses to remember rather than forget, they are continuing this fight. The fight against forgetting, against silence, against indifference. Therefore, I invite you not to let this story die with this video. Share, discuss, question. Make this memory fuel for change. And if you've made it this far, if this narrative touched something within you, I ask that you subscribe to the channel. Here, we bring you stories that cannot be forgotten, stories that challenge us to think, feel, and act. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any episodes. Because remembering is an act of courage. And courage is what we need to build a world where evil never again has room to grow. Thank you for walking with me on this journey through humanity's dark and complex past. See you in the next video, where we will continue to uncover stories that shaped our present, and that can save our future. Until then, remember, justice begins with each of us, and it must be vigilant, constant, and, above all, human.